Hi everybody, happy you watching this video. So we are going to talk about the very important part of the aviation law, airspaces. So there will be a lot of information. You can see the list of the topics we are going to discuss today. And let's start. So the biggest subdivision of the airspace in the world is the flight information region. So those flight information region usually they coincide with the national borders of the countries. But in some cases, for larger countries, the airspace is subdivided into a number of regional FIRs. And in opposite, in case of small countries, some FIRs encompass the territorial airspace of several countries. So this subdivision among authorities is done by international agreement through the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. And FIRs, they have existed at least since 1947. On the territory of these FIRs, the Flight Information Service, FIS, and Alerting Service are provided. We will talk about this and at the next slide. And so what about vertical boundaries? FIR starts from the ground to flight level 195, and there is some additional upper information region UIR, which extends from flight level 195 and up without any boundary from the up. The Flight Information Service is the next level of subdivision of the airspace. As we said, that flight information region can be separated to smaller flight information service zones, like we can see on the example. In one FIR we can see at least four, I count four flight information services with different frequencies of the radio. So as we said, in these flight information services, in these flight information zones, the flight information service is provided, and also alerting service is provided. So these services are available to any aircraft. They can inform you about potentially conflicting traffic, and also the flight information service includes the meteorological information on aerodromes, information on possible hazard to flight, but the Flight Information Service does not provide the positive separation from the traffic. So now let's move to the airspace classes. We have three kinds of airspace classes. The controlled airspaces from A to E, and there is an advisory airspace, F, and uncontrolled airspace, G. Controlled airspace. We have classes of the controlled airspace from A to E, so they are classified as controlled airspace within which the air traffic control, ATC, is provided. So the controlled airspace is designated to provide separation service for en route controlled traffic, and ATC clearance is required for all traffic in the controlled airspace. Advisory airspace is kind of class of the airspace in between the controlled and uncontrolled airspace. So it's identified as advisory, in which the advisory ATC service is provided only to IFR traffic. And so you need to file a flight plan for IFR only. And ATC clearance is not required. Actually, the class F now is not commonly used. At least there is no class F in Europe, in European Union, and in the UC. Uncontrolled airspace, I think it's most common and more interesting for VFR flights, VFR pilots, because it's the basic airspace where you can fly without any clearance and without filing the flight plan. So the only flight information service is provided for all the traffic in the uncontrolled airspace. and as we said, the ATC clearance is not required to enter the uncontrolled airspace. So in this table we can see the vertical boundaries of the airspaces and a difference between the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration rules in the US, and EASA, European Aviation Safety Agency in the European Union. I don't want to read all this text from this table. I just want to mention that there are some slight difference between those aviation authorities. For example, in Europe there are no classes A and B used, and for class C there are a little bit different designation of the class C between those authorities, and different vertical boundaries. And also, as we mentioned before, class F is not used in both of the administrations, and uncontrolled airspace G is the vertical boundaries is a little bit different in FAA and EASA zones. So here is the graphical interpretation of the classification of the airspaces by FAA. So class A, it's an upper airspace designated only for IFR traffic, and class B is the controlled airspace surrounding the national busiest airports. Class C is the controlled airspace surrounding airports that have the operational control tower and services by radar approach control. And class D is designated for airports with an operational control tower only. Class E, it's other non-classified controlled airspace. And as we talked above, class F, the advisory airspace, is not used in USA. And class G is just uncontrolled airspace, where it's available. Usually it's the upper boundary of class G is only 1,200 feet AGL. The airspace classes by EASA classification is a little bit simpler, because EASA is trying to simplify rules and use less classes of the airspace. So the classes A and B, they are not used. Class C is used only for common controlled traffic above flight level 9.5, or class C is also designated for busiest airport from the upper level of D airspace. And D airspace is designated for control zones and terminal maneuvering areas for other airports. Class E is just other common controlled airspace. Class F, advisory airspace, also is not used in the European Union. And class G is the uncontrolled airspace, which is which starts from the ground, from 0 AGL, and extends to 1,000 feet AGL or 2,500 feet AGL in mountain area. Also need to mention that in class C, VFR flights are prohibited starting from the level 195. And in this table I decided to bring the information about the services are provided in different classes, the requirements about the getting ATS clearance, about the ATS separation services provided, and requirements about the radio communication, requirements about the filing the flight plan, and also requirements about the having or using the secondary surveillance radar mode. So just need to remember this table. This table should be very useful while passing the theory exam in the Civil Aviation Authority. So I don't want to read all the table, but let's take two of the airspaces and deal up with those services and requirements for the class of the airspace. Let's take G, the uncontrolled airspace. So in this class, VFR flights are provided only with the flight information service and alerting service, and IFR flights also provided with flight information service and alerting service. And in some countries, en route IFR is not allowed in G class of the airspace, so you don't need to get clearance, and you're not provided with traffic separation. You don't need to have the radio communication to fly in the G class, and no need to file the flight plan, and also need to carry the transponder on the board of the airplane. And let's also take the C class. So we can see that in C class for VFR flights, ATC, air traffic control and flight information service are provided, and for FR flights the air traffic control is provided. So you need to get clearance to enter this airspace. And about separation, let's deal up with this. So for IFR flights and for special VFR, separation provided to other IFR traffic, SVFR, special VFR traffic, and for VFR traffic. And starting up from flight level 100 in the European Union, all traffic is provided with traffic separation. And you need to have the two-way radio communication to fly in the C class, and you have to file the flight plan and have the secondary surveillance radar C mode. So there are some speed limitations for each class of the airspace for VFR and IFR. As we mentioned, that classes A and B, they are not used in the European Union, and VFR traffic is not allowed in class A, so that means that there is no speed limitations for VFR, and IFR traffic is not limited by the speed in those classes in the United States. Sorry. For class C, there is a speed limit for VFR traffic as 250 knots below the flight level 100, and also in all TMA zones. And there is no limitation for IFR traffic. So for class D and E, there is the speed limit as 250 knots for VFR and IFR traffic. And for class G, the same. For VFR is 250 knots is the limit, and IFR traffic is not allowed in the G class. So what's the control area? CTA. CTA is the controlled airspace which extends to the up from the specific limit above the Earth to the specific upper limit. So this is the area of the airspace designated to provide service for en route controlled flights. And in order to enter this control area, you always need to get ATC clearance. So what's the control zone is? CTR. CTR is the part of the airspace which extends upward from the surface to the specified upper limit. This airspace is designated to provide ATC to arriving and departing controlled traffic in busy airports. It extends from, as we said, from the ground level to an altitude or flight level, or it can be restricted from the up by the boundary of the CTA. Also, ATC clearance is required to enter the control zone. So what the terminal maneuvering area is? So this controlled airspace is designated for providing the approach control service for busy airports. It's usually larger than CTR, and also the ATC clearance is required to enter the TMA airspace. So we finished discussing the airspace classification, Now let's talk a little bit about restricted areas. So there are some set of the restricted areas like prohibited, restricted or danger areas, military zones, temporary reserved, restricted and segregated areas. So those areas could be permanent, they could be temporarily active, and you could find the boundaries of these areas on the aeronautical charts, and together with the designator, the code of those zones, and with the boundaries, vertical boundaries of those zones. In case if of those restricted areas they are temporarily active, better to check latest NOTAM, notice to airman, to check the activity and change of the status. In case again, if you have any, if you're unsure about the activity of those zones, better to ask Flight Information Service to obtain actual information about the restricted areas on your route. So here we can see the examples of the prohibited areas on the EASA and FAA charts, aeronautical charts. And so those airspaces designated to establish some security areas for reasons associated to the national welfare. And violating of those prohibited areas may result in interception of the aircraft and possibility of the attack upon the violating aircraft. So don't enter the prohibited areas if you don't want to pay for the interception to the government. Those areas have designators, and usually this designator contains the symbol P, it's a prohibited area, and the country designation code. As an example, LK, this is the designator for the EASA country, and P stands for prohibited, and 40 is the 40, but it could be a code of this particular prohibited area. The restricted area is designated for any reasons related to the activities considered to be hazardous for aircrafts, such like an artillery firing or aerial gunnery, usually for military reasons. Again, those areas usually are depicted on the aeronautical charts with the designator and the boundaries, vertical boundaries of those areas. I need to check NOTAMs and contact Flight Information Service to determine the time of usage of those restricted areas. So danger areas, also the reasons of creating those areas are very similar to restricted areas, which includes the military exercises involving firing, parachute dropping, violent or unpredictable aircraft maneuvers, military aircraft maneuvers, or use the unmanned aerial systems. Again, I need to check those areas on the aeronautical charts and check the NOTAM and ask the Flight Information Service about the activity of those danger areas. So the temporary reserved areas, those areas is not fully restricted, and in some cases you can transit this area with getting appropriate ATC clearance. So the temporary restricted areas, those areas are really temporary. You can't find those areas on the aeronautical charts, or the information of those areas is not published on Aeronautical Information Published, but you can find the information about the activity and dimension of those zones, areas in NOTAMs or supplementary of the Aeronautical Information Published, and plan your route of your flight according to this information. Temporary segregated area, it's one more kind of restricted areas. So they are designated to and active when some aerial operations are conducted, and when those areas are active, it's not permitted to fly in those areas. So there could be military zones. They are abbreviated as MATZ, Military Aerodrome Traffic Zone, for example. Also, there could be military operation areas and parachute jump operations. So it's possible to enter the military zones sometimes. Just need to ask air traffic control, at least in 15 nautical miles or 5 minutes of flying time from the MATZ boundary. In some cases you can cross this military area if you have appropriate ATC clearance. So I would like to bring additional information about the local airports. So in some small airports where is no control tower, there is a traffic zone where the flight service station is available. So in this case you can ask the required information about traffic, wind, the operating runways, and you have to give the intentions to enter advisory area. You don't need to get the clearance, but you always have to give intention on the frequency of those flight service station. For remote airports with no control tower, no flight service station, so you can just use the radio frequency to communicate between aircrafts. So usually those local airport advisory and remote airport advisory zones, traffic zones, they vary from the country to country. But in Europe, for example, the radius of this zone around the airport is about just 2.5 nautical miles. In United States, if I remember right, the radius can be up to 10 nautical miles. So that's it for the airspaces classification and different zones. Hope it was useful for you, and take care. Thank you.